Okay, without further ado, it is a pleasure to welcome our speakers today in our 10th episode on the series for the Colombian presidential elections. We will discuss the results that came in just last night and what it means in political terms and also with respect to public policy. I would like to thank the Stimson Center. We will now divide the conversation in two parts. The first one will focus on what happened and why, and the second part on what this means from now going onwards in terms of governability, the balance of powers, and the policies that will be appearing in the future. We have really wonderful panelists, and I'm very glad to welcome them now. Alvaro Forero Tascón is a columnist from El Espectador. Marcela Meléndez, executive director of this institution. The General Óscar Naranjo, former vice president of Colombia and former director of the National Police. And Rodrigo Uprimny. Welcome, everyone. I am also very pleased to be presenting our co-moderators, James Bosworth, Associated Researcher from the Stimson Center and Director of the Report for Latin America, and Ken Frankel, President of the Canadian Council for the Americas. Without further ado, I give the floor to Ken. Thank you very much, Ken. Thank you very much, Marta. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. We will start immediately with a question. And Marcela, I will start with you, if I may. The question is quite easy, actually. What do these results tell us about the current moment of the Colombian political system? Well, I think that we are profoundly divided. That is a key takeaway. I think that what we saw yesterday in the elections is the same division that the country has suffered for more than a decade. If you take a look at the electoral map, it's pretty much the same. I do not think that this was actually a mobilization for the center or the support of the center for Abelardo de la Espriella. I think this involves the participation of the center, center right, center left. What we're seeing in Colombia, I think, is an unprecedented electoral process. And I think that as a result, the next government will have a very important task ahead, which will be to have all of those elements into account. I think this will be a very complex period because I think that the Congress is not put together in such a way that there will be, a clear majority. And I think that this means many things in terms of the challenges that the country faces. Immediate crisis that will require consensus and that will require not only consensus among those who will govern us, but also among the citizens regarding being able to place our perspective on the most urgent and pressing problems and how we can solve them. I think that is actually the main message from the elections yesterday. I think that there is a very clear message from Colombians, and I think that there is no doubt that Abelardo de la Espriella is the president-elect, and I think that it's become clear that there's a challenge to bring together a fractured country. That's my kickoff for this conversation. Thank you, Marcela. Alvaro, where is Colombia at this point? The immediate perspective takes place now, but I think that if we see the forest instead of the tree, I think there are two fundamental aspects. One was the big doubt 4 years ago, which is the consolidation of the left. In Colombia, the left had never been competitive before, and there was this big doubt on whether they would reach the government or would it grow or not. And regarding the controversies in the government of Gustavo Petro, I think that it has become clear that yesterday the left had almost 50% of the electors, and that for any minority sector is very significant, and especially so for one that went from being a marginal political force to have the government and then to consolidate itself. So I think that's a very important thing. That voting matches the image shown by the surveys about the image of Gustavo Petro. And the left does not have a majority in the parliament, but is by far the biggest force right now. And it still has all the tools to move forward. And it has a big political capacity. In Colombia, we have the tradition of having very powerful presidents that govern for many years, with the president of Alvaro Uribe, who has had a strong influence in politics over the past 20 years. And this has an agenda. There is an agenda that is very important to defend. And if the government attacks it in terms of salaries, in terms of rights, it will create big controversies. And there is also an MO in Colombia that sets something apart, which is the fact that we have a populist political system, and it is handled by certain people who pull in one direction or pull in the other direction. And I think that the left was able to use a similar tool, populism, and it will continue to use it as opposition. Right-wing populism governed with Alvaro Uribe and then had to confront the government of Santos, and it was able to go back to power in 2018. And this is another important point for things to be clear. Colombia has a populist political system that has matured over time. The populisms of Latin America have expanded, but not many countries have had this experience. Colombia is now experiencing its second right-wing government after Uribe, now Espriella. And so countries like Argentina, who have only had one right-wing government, populist right-wing government, or the example of Brazil, we are more like Peru, where we see that a right-wing populist will win with Keiko Fujimori. And so these two things, I think, in a way, explain a lot. And I believe that there is a wave in the entire continent for right-wing populism. 6 countries now where right-wing populist governments have won: Honduras, Argentina, Chile, Peru, El Salvador, Bolivia. And the big question here is, what will be imposed? Will it be that international wave that imposes itself, or will the political center be able to channel those forces and win? And although the political center was important because it's what gave the left the chance to almost match the right, well, it wasn't enough, because the number of votes wasn't enough, but it was a clear factor in this case. And so I believe that that wave that is pushed by Donald Trump has sufficient force in the entire continent, and it was able to impose itself. But I would say that that wave is also losing momentum, because Bukele won with approximately 17%, Katz with 12% in Chile, Milei with about 11% of difference with the second one. These are the differences. And in Colombia, we're talking about 1%. And so I think this is quite significant, because the next election will be in Brazil. Brazil is the big question mark, whether that wave will be enough to include Brazil or not. Thank you, Alvaro. Rodrigo, one possible interpretation is that the people are divided, 50-50. But there are many signals and evidence of the fact that there were many people that did not really want to make the decision that they had to make yesterday, that they really didn't want either candidate. So is Colombia truly divided 50-50? This is a very good question, Ken. I will get to answering it, but first I wanted to underline something that has to do with these elections. I think it showed the best and the worst aspects of Colombian democracy. The best was that an hour and a half later, we had the results, and everything indicates that they will be accepted by all the forces. The Pacto Histórico confirmed that the voting has been finished, and Iván Cepeda said that he accepted the final result. There was a pre-counting of the votes yesterday that didn't have legal value, but in general, this is usually matching 100% of the final counting of the votes. So this shows elections where even before people went to vote, there are many things that sometimes may take place, illegal actions. There could be pressure of armed groups. But once the vote is casted, once the ballot is casted, the system works. And that's very important. And with such a small difference of less than 1%, so less than 250,000 votes, the most likely scenario is that we will have alternation between far right and left governments, and that will take place institutionally. Just like 4 years ago, there was a transition which was peaceful after very tense elections, but a peaceful transition from a right-wing government to a left-wing government, like we had 4 years ago. I believe that this shows an idea of strength and the strength of the Colombian institutions. And I think that is a very good thing. The bad thing is that if these were elections with polarizing discourses, and that was the case, which leads me to answering your question. If you take a look at the electoral results, once we reach presidential elections, the country has become polarized ever since the referendum of 2016. Like Marcela said, and I agree with her in that, when we reach that point, and we were not able to reduce the polarization, it is not bad to have a division, but to have this kind of corrosive polarization with mutual stigmatization, that is more difficult. But when you are able to emerge from these difficult moments, the corrosive polarization is not so clear. If you see what happens in the Congress in the midterm elections in March, the parties that represent a clear right and a clear left had more or less, each one, more or less, yes, say 25% more or less. And 50% was distributed amongst parties that are difficult to pin down in terms of ideology. Some are more right-wing, some are more left-wing, some are more center. They're harder to describe. And if you conduct surveys and you ask people, and although those who consider themselves left have grown in the surveys, more 25 or 30%, that's stayed the same. There is still a high percentage of people who define themselves as center right, or center left. And when you look at the major problems that divide the waters, for example, LGBTQ community, abortion, the management of economy, peace and security. It's not that Colombians are fully aligned on one side against the other party that is aligned with a different ideology. I think that happens when it's presidential elections. And it's because of the way things work when it comes to electing a president with a first round and a runoff. There is a polarization. And because the political center has been very clumsy in Colombia, unfortunately, one of the main responsibles here is Sergio Fajardo. Sergio Fajardo was a center candidate who, in December of last year, was one of the candidates with the most favorable conditions. Even in January, there was about 12 and 13%. And if we had promoted a consultation and there would have been other processes, the center would have played a bigger role. But what happened in the past 2 elections, even I may say the last 3 elections, is the collapse of the center parties. There are no longer solid center parties because there's a lot of individualism. I share this view with Marcela. I think that this happens when it's a presidential election. And this also reflects whether this is a yes or no situation. I think that when we vote for a party or when there are public discussions, I think that Colombia is less polarized than the United States, for example. I think that's a little bit my hope, and that despite that profound political division that exists and that was reflected in this presidential election, I believe that there are still social forces at play that should allow to build bridges and to articulate or to avoid radicalization of the far right, which would be very detrimental for the country. Thank you, Rodrigo. Rodrigo was speaking about the referendum 10 years ago and speaking about the situation in Colombia. How can we compare the environment 10 years ago to what we have now? Thank you very much. First of all, let me greet the audience and these distinguished panelists who are here with me and the host as well. And I'd like to answer the following to your question. But before I answer, I'd like to make a comment. This divided country that has been mentioned throughout this conversation is very important for us to take into account the fact that this is reflected in the territorial results of the elections, which means this is a map where the periphery is clearly marked by a result in favor of Iván Cepeda versus a central vote that was mostly for Abelardo. And what does this actually mean? In my opinion, it means that today, more than ever before, we have consolidated what we may call a political scream of the periphery, which has become extremely demanding to bridge the inequality gaps and to focus on the territory of the profound Colombia, or the deep Colombia, as they call it. So one of the heritage of Gustavo Petro is that those sectors of the population in the periphery, in rural Colombia, and an area that has been a victim of the armed conflict, but also of the abandonment. And this is becoming increasingly important, and politically, they feel represented by a more organic left. And this, I'd like to connect this with the efforts that were made in the negotiation process, where the negotiations with FARC were important, and closing the gaps of that marginal Colombia, of that Colombia that was forgotten and was left to the hands of the conflict. The process led to an agreement, and the agreement led to a roadmap to overcome those challenges. And in the face of Ken's question, I think what is deeply regretful is that 10 years after the signature of that agreement, 10 years after a referendum, political leaderships, far from building bridges to move forward in the construction of a process to address the needs of Colombians, far from that, it is becoming more polarized. And I think that what we are facing now, I hope I am wrong, and I hope that that the president-elect, after the counting or the pre-counting, I hope that he will repurpose his strategy for peace, and that he will focus on peace, because that Roman peace, as he calls it, what this will lead to was to crush your opponents to ensure peace in Colombia. And I think that this type of approach, I think, would be the cherry on the cake, yes, of a fragmented country, of a country who is divided. And and what should be a meeting point for a national agreement to overcome violence and to transform the territories and to build peace. Thank you very much. There is one thing that I'd like to refer to with respect to Marcela's comment. There is a center in Colombia. I mean, 50% of the voters consider themselves at the center of politics. What happened yesterday with the center? How did they vote? And what is their perspective? But even more importantly, in the future, is the center the opposition now? Or is the center trying to, or will they try to govern with Abelardo? And what is Abelardo's role in this negotiation with the center? Will he work with the center or only with the far right? I think that null votes were also very important. Blank votes were very important yesterday as well. If you think that it was more than 2 points, that's where you see the difference between those two candidates. People who did not choose either candidate. So I think that part of the center analyzed the situation in terms that they thought that there was one that was less worse than the other, and they had to vote. That is the case for many people. And I think that fear played a key role, and our imagination regarding what could happen if one candidate or the other won. Over the weekend, I was thinking about how our mind plays games on us, because the person, if the person is questioning everything that the other person is saying, or the person thinks that they're telling the full truth, things become complicated. I think that people find it hard to go against what they want to vote. And a lot of these people voted from fear, I think. What do I think about Abelardo and how will he play with the center? I think that Jose Manuel, the vice president, is like a call for technocracy, a gesture where he said that we will govern with people who are fully capable of understanding certain things. And in that technocracy, I think they will capture a lot of the center. And we will see how strong the vice president will be, because from what we've seen, except for, I mean, in general, vice presidents in Colombia are not very powerful. So we will see. We will see what happens. Of course, with all due respect, for General Óscar Naranjo, who was in a completely different situation, but we will have to see. I do think that the big loser, the major loser, is the center here. The center was not able to find its ground, its position, but it has to do with what General Naranjo said, and I echo his words. I fully support what he said. It has failed to connect with that reality who is screaming, to make their voices heard, for them to recognize the need to have a more equal and fairer country, and that is able to connect with those people who have been invisibilized historically. Thank you very much. And the same question for Alvaro. What will happen with the center, and who is the opposition now? Starting with President Petro, or is it the center? How can we define the opposition here, and what will happen in the streets? I think that it's very difficult for the center to have a good result. It was very difficult for the center to have a good result in this scenario, because what happened with Gustavo Petro was not just another candidate. It was the left arriving at power, and Petro wasn't able to do many of the things that he wanted to do because the opposition blocked pretty much everything that he wanted to do in terms of legislation and social reform. He was able to manage to do some, but with a great level of difficulty. The polarization was so big that Gustavo Petro understood that his way out was radicalization. And the truth is that he tried to make this election revolve around class struggle once again. And in Colombia, that is quite strange, because since the beginnings of the last century, the political system was very afraid of that topic. And Petro was able to present this topic in a country where the level of inequality is major. And there is a lack of participation of popular sectors. So it was relatively easy for that to prosper because he brought this topic forward. And Petro did so to reinforce and to force the right towards the extreme. We also have a right in Colombia, led by Alvaro Uribe, which is the far right, and who was able to impose his candidates in all elections, sometimes winning or losing, but Uribe has imposed his candidates in every election. And the center right moved more towards the right. So it went to the hands of Alvaro Uribe. And I think that Uribe understood that what happened could happen in the last elections. That divided was the right was divided into a populist right and an institutionalist right, and it lost in the first round. So in this time, I think they were aware that there was a populist wave in Latin America and that a candidate like Abelardo de la Espriella seems designed in a similar way to Bukele, etc. And he knew that they would have the support of Donald Trump. So I think that both of these leaders who have the biggest parties, I think they both decided to go to the extremes because, and I think they were right if you analyze it pragmatically. And so they really devastated the center, and the center found it very difficult to find its ground. The left had a very good strategy trying to absorb the center with a right-wing candidate, but choosing a center candidate for Paloma Valencia. And so I think this picked up a lot of the candidates from the center. And so under these circumstances, things became very difficult. Consultations between parties this time did not play the role that they played in the last election, because in the center case, Uribism would go into the game and win. So it was difficult. It was difficult to become the Oviedo of that consultation. And one consultation with Claudia Lopez, when the voters were already very polarized, I think it wouldn't have helped. So I think that the center in Colombia does not have a strong party, has not had a historical leader. They're occasional leaders, but they've been suffering for many elections now because the polarization of the second round consumes them. In the first round, it's usually weak, and then the second round is devastating. And in this situation, things were very difficult for them. And it's the same thing that happened in Chile and Peru and many countries. The extremes are winning. And Colombia, not having a tradition of having a center party, it grows and shrinks depending on the context. In addition to this, the center, for many years, was in a way the result of the parties, the conservatives, the liberals, the moderates, that would reach out to the center. And that historically has deprived them of a certain strength. I have quite a different view of Alvaro Uribe's role. I think he's the main loser in this election because his candidate did not go anywhere. I do agree that he was probably playing, both ways, but he was actually replaced by this other leader who is an outsider like Abelardo de la Espriella. I don't know what the others think, but I think that he's no longer the representative of the far right in these elections. I don't know what the other ones think. Well, when Ivan Duque won, we believed that we would be having new blood, and Uribe laid low, and it's possible. I mean, we know that Espriella has the will to become one of these strong leaders, and we will see if he is able to achieve it. But I do believe that Alvaro Uribe played, sort of supported both candidates very much consciously. And when we talk about these caudillos, these leaders, what do you have to say, Rodrigo? I agree with Marcela. I think that Alvaro Uribe is not a winner in these elections. I think he has been partially defeated. Not the same with Duque. Duque was Uribe's candidate. I think De la Espriella didn't even mention Uribe in his acceptance speech. So I think that we are facing a new right-wing leader, and it's a type of right that is more similar to Milei, more similar to Bukele, and the president of Ecuador that I can't remember now. Noboa. Yes, I prefer not to remember it, but it's a Freudian slip, Rodrigo. But I have a different perspective than Alvaro's regarding the role of the center. I think that Sergio Fajardo had a major responsibility and made terrible mistakes because of his arrogance and his thirst for power. I think that there was an extreme center there. He rejected the extremes in a very purist manner, but he never opened up to the possibility of agreeing with other center players for anything, for any type of project. I think that if Fajardo called for a type of consultation in December last year when he had 12 or 15% of support in the polls, and if he had said, I want to be the leader of a center consultation, I think that probably several of the ones that were part of the consultation with Paloma Valencia would have joined, but he didn't do that. He didn't do that because he thought he could make it alone. Even in January, when the consultation had already been presented by the center right, which was in fact right, there was an article by Mauricio Cabrera where he did all of the maths, made all the calculations based on the surveys, and he said that those who were still presenting themselves as center, Claudia López, Fajardo, Hermitage, and Murillo, because the others had already gone with Paloma Valencia. But if we had brought together those four, the percentages were equal to the center and equal to Abelardo de la Espriella. And so there was actually a real situation, but he refused to do it. So I think that it is not just a matter of, what is happening in that sense, but also the fact that the center wasn't able to recognize this. I agree with Marcelo and with Alvaro. The fact that the center that doesn't speak about social reform cannot call itself center. Those who say Petro is too extreme, no, they weren't able to pick up on that message, the message that the regions are expressing and conveying, saying that they need social reform to overcome the profound inequalities that exist. And we also need security, of course. I think that was the path forward. That's where a central discourse could have been built. And there were voters for that. Then we all ended up trapped in the polarization. I voted for Claudia López in the first round, because I have many discrepancies with Gustavo Petro, and I think that there's a major responsibility that Sergio Fajardo has to assume because of the impossibility of building a center coalition that could have been a solution. Many of us said something to him, but he refused. So I think that that possibility existed, and the electoral dynamics are leading the processes towards polarization. That needs to be assessed. But that also has to do with leaderships. It has to do with the way electoral systems work. And I do think that presidential elections with a second round usually generate a polarization. It's just a fact. It's inevitable. Yes. And so people need to align with one or the other. But there could be institutional designs or clearer systems. Fajardo recognized the social reforms and the changes that were necessary, but he went to a discourse from 2018. And I think he refused that consultation of the center that could have really yielded good results if it had been done in January or December. By March, it was a bit too late. But I think that if it had been presented at the time, I think the situation would have been a lot different. But that didn't happen, unfortunately. Thank you very much, Rodrigo. What we would like to do now is to talk about what will come in the future and the most salient topics. Óscar Naranjo, the issue of security. Security has been very important throughout the campaign. Could you tell us more about your analysis with respect to security in Colombia, what the status of security is in Colombia, and what the plans are for in Abelardo's plan to solve these issues? Let me begin by saying that it is quite the paradox to see that a campaign such as the one that we experienced and which prioritized security ended up proposing such simplistic messages and messages that are impossible to apply in practice. It is surprising and quite astonishing to see that although campaigns did recognize that security is a priority issue in the citizens' agenda, the response and the proposal in general was not only a very poor response, and like I said, inapplicable. Yes, it was impossible to put into practice. In the case of the candidate who won, the security proposal is based on 4 or 5 elements that he calls his central elements. There was a shock plan where he promised that in 90 days he will recover control of the territory. That is quite the challenge, yes, to think that he will recover territorial control while not recognizing that it is not sufficient to bring the military into the territory, but rather that we are in the face of an increasingly worrying problem of criminal governance. Yes, I'm talking about organized crime that control the territory with weapons, control the behavior of citizens, and that take over different instances of government through corruption or through intimidation. And to complete the scenario, they are making investments with that illegal collection of money in the territories to the point where in the last 2 years, there's an inventory where there were 76 official openings by these groups, openings of health centers, of roads, of schools, which of course results in the support of those communities. And it is very clear that it is impossible for him to win over these territories once again in 90 days. Now, with respect to what has to do with the national security demand, which is reflected in the suffering of citizens due to extortion. This is generalized extortion. This is an extortion that does not distinguish levels of economic power, and that creates extortion to a street seller or even a small business owner or someone working in rural areas. The proposal of this campaign is that there will be like a group dedicated especially to eliminating all forms of extortion. I participated in the design of these task forces where there were, for example, Pablo Escobar was the target. I have seen that a similar structure that is similar to a task force focused on extortion, but created in this way, we still have to see what results will appear and if this will be or not an early victory for a government which has a very simplistic proposal and quite populistic, to be honest. And on the other hand, there is a goal that he presented, and it's that in 90 days, he will focus on 10 high-value targets. In Colombia, high-value targets are about 100. And even in the context of this government, which still has so many failures in terms of territorial control, even with this situation, we have maybe 10 high-value objectives every 30 days. So I think that the proposal is very limited unless he is calling high-value targets things that we are not familiar with. And finally, the model that has triggered his enthusiasm, and not just his, but also the enthusiasm of several leaders in the region, is the Bukele model. The Bukele model that conceives security based on the imprisonment. He proposed the construction of 7 mega prisons. We will have to see how he fills those proposals with actual content, because I don't know what qualifies as mega prisons for 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 inmates. And on the other hand, who will he be taking to those mega prisons, and that will actually have an impact in reducing violence and insecurity? I am confident that a campaign that has been mobilized based on a surreal logic of politics, more based on triggering emotions and more based on like a media show, now that he has received the support of the Colombian people, this is when the realism knocks on his door. So we will see who will work with him. If it's people who have worked with him in the campaign, I hope it's people who know security, because security is not really about a silver bullet for zero tolerance, for example. The new government will have an inheritance which at central level is highly challenged and questioned, but territorially, it is highly valued by the communities. Let me give you an example. There have been 100 people that were relocated and they have left their weapons and they are waiting for the advancement of the peace process. When you talk to the people in those regions, they see that those are efforts, and those are efforts that lead to less violence. So this was a particular group, and these are 100 people that were in the south of Colombia. And this process, I'm mentioning it because these are things that the communities in the territory are seeing. Some of them are more restricted, but there are objective data. For example, Tumaco. Tumaco has shown a reduction of homicides that had not been seen in those municipalities in decades. This is a result of the total peace processes. So I think that political security, peace, and drug policies will be three main challenges that the new government will be facing. I have a question for you, Marcela. This security agenda is a very expensive one, yes, to build these prisons and to mobilize the army. What would you like to say about security, but also the big promise made by de la Espriella is that he will have an austerity agenda like Javier Milei's, but he cannot have both. He can't have the security agenda and the austerity agenda to reduce the presence of the state and reduce the expenses in general. So how will he strike a balance between these two things? So first, I will talk about the fiscal balance, but I will also add to what General Naranjo just said. I think that security and justice are a development problem. And I think that there are many processes that are important. We believe that there will be a public voice in terms of this. And I was thinking about the fact that this is a very difficult problem and that has many different dimensions. So it needs to be simplified by prioritizing territories, understanding the state capacity, and understanding that the security policy, if you think about it, the justice, law and order, law enforcement, and the penitentiary, those three pillars, I think this has to be part of a security policy that includes the presence of the state and social policies and services. We have to understand that we are no longer in a moment where we can choose A or B. So it's either military solution or social policy. It is not enough. We have restrictions in terms of budget. We will have to prioritize. And in that prioritization, we need to understand that we are facing a problem that is not Colombian, it's transnational, and that we will not be able to fight against and eliminate it because we have to coexist by minimizing risk and by minimizing problems like extortion, like the recruitment of minors, and the worst problems affecting society. So I think that the complexity is much wider than what is being expressed in the speeches given by the candidates. The president-elect has a scary, in my opinion, proposal in terms of prisons, also because he doesn't understand the separation of powers. Yes, and how one of the main challenges is that prisons should become humanizing contexts where the inmates do not become more criminal after being in jail. So I think that the next 90 days are key in that regard. And when we think about the money and having a fiscal problem of the magnitude that we are facing here in Colombia, it's important that any government understands that there needs to be some kind of adjustment because that will signal, send a good signal to international markets. If there is not a balance, the results are what we see now, which we can find resources, but they are very expensive. We need to reorder our accounts to be able to find those resources that the markets are needing. The challenge is huge because expenses in Colombia are very inflexible. If you think that there are things that are more superficial or not, that's not really the case. We have to coexist with an inflexibility of the expenditures, which have to do with the real needs of the population in the health sector, education, etc. So I think that this will represent a challenge in terms of how the law for territorial competition is enforced and regulated if this moves forward, because this involves understanding the restrictions and making each penny count. One thing that we need to pay attention to is how we think under this new legal framework and how the resources are distributed within the territory to be able to pay for public health, education, water, etc. And so I think that there's also a big challenge in terms of how we generate income. And that's, again, a quite a wide question. In the short term, not many things can change, but we must focus on how we make our economy grow and understanding the regulatory frameworks to promote investments, to create employment. And we may need to rethink something more of a gradual approach, because Colombia has the possibility of having fossil fuels and reaching fiscal balance through that. We cannot afford to waste those resources. So I think that there's a major decision that needs to be made by this government, and the way in which we see the government now, how Gustavo Petro thought about clean energies and transition. I think that Colombia is not fully ready for 100% of that, because we need the resources now. My point is, we need an adjustment, and I think the next government knows this full well. I think that it's a super complicated decision because we don't know where we will get that income and when we can cut down on expenses. But I think we've been thinking for a long time that if there is an adjustment, this will squeeze the economy and it will involve more suffering. But I think that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, because if there's an adjustment, the international markets will look at us differently. And this will allow us to bring new investments to Colombians, and Colombians who took their money outside of the country may bring them back in. And more fiscal collection will improve things. We don't know who the Minister of Economy will be, because he or she will be responsible for the possibilities that this government will have to move forward in this difficult context. Thank you. Alvaro, speaking about security, what should be done in the first 90 days? What is the reality like, and what will he be doing in the first 3 months? And what will happen in the remainder of his government? I think that this campaign hasn't been very concrete in terms of public policies. Like General Naranjo was saying, the candidate of law and order has certain goals that are not very credible or not very likely. There is an oversimplification of reality. And in Colombia, the armed conflict has become very, very complex, and how much it looks or not like the one in Mexico. And then the possibility of confronting this. The war of guerrilla camps, of the past is no longer the case. Yes. More and more, we are seeing crime that is more and more connected with the civil society. And so, as a result, we don't really know what will happen. And we don't really know who will be in charge. We don't know who the Minister of Defense will be, etc. And so I think that there is a lack of clarity right now. In the case of the ELN, they were seeking shelter in Venezuela, but now this should change with the presence of Trump administration in Venezuela. So I'm no longer in a position to say. I think that he froze. I think his video froze. This shows the uncertainty. Yes, it's a mystery. I'd like to say something. I think that Colombia has to stop talking about armed conflict. I think they need to talk about organized crime. Sorry, Alvaro. Yes, you disconnected for a minute. So, Alvaro, you can continue, and then we will ask Rodrigo about legal stability and the constitutional framework. In terms of insecurity, there is a lot of uncertainty and zero tolerance and mano dura. These policies, we don't even know what they mean anymore. Without being an economist, I know that there are no easy solutions. There has been a lot of manipulations in terms of the assessments made by the government who victimized, who played the victim, and also how there were so many half-truths told. The problems are structural, and the health problems come from structural issues in public financing in Colombia. Yes, other issues that have found the solution in fiscal reforms, and in this administration that was suspended. The government of Santos had 4 of them, Duque had 3, and I think that what this created was an accumulation of deficit and of debt, which will pose a significant problem for the next government, and especially fiscal adjustments. Because especially with populist governments, their strength is not really based on political parties, but rather in the people's support. And in Colombia, Petro focused on social policy that were very much connected to public spending, and it will not be easy to cut down on them, or this will have a very high political cost. So we will have to wait and see how the government solves this issue. For example, there was an official allegation that in order to maintain the high salaries, the businessmen would have to pay more taxes. But in this crisis, this is a very complex thing to do. But how many of those 20,000 major capitals will go back to paying 30-something% when they're struggling already? So I think that the main problem that I see here is that the new government will have to become like brutally honest with respect to reality. And this will be very difficult in terms of the economy, in terms of security. We have certain solutions and tools that are lacking, yes, and are insufficient. I do hope that the government will try to find agreements in Congress, and hopefully we will have public policies that are not so extreme and simplistic. In El Salvador, there is no, or like the case of El Salvador, there's no easy task ahead. He will have to work with the opposition. Like I said, there are no easy solutions. And for example, from a fiscal perspective, things are growing rapidly, and it is increasing and augmenting. The hope at this point, just like the president-elect de la Espriella, does not really know what public policies are all about, and he has this message and also with the vice president, we have some signals that may point towards the choosing of technical experts because we will need them. Thank you, Alvaro. Rodrigo, we want to go to another important point in the campaign, which is legal stability and institutional framework of the country. So those who are worried about, or who were worried with Ivan Cepeda and with the threat, quote unquote, of provoking certain issues that could emerge. You have written extensively on the comparison of the risks between one candidate and the other. Now we know who the winner is. So can you talk a little bit about your perspective on possible threats or how they can develop the institutional framework with the new president, and how the judiciary will work to act as a counterbalance? I think that this was a bit of a strange discussion that took place in the country because Ivan Cepeda was shown as a risk for constitutional democracy and Abelardo de la Espriella as a defender. And I think it is completely the opposite. The big problem of Cepeda was to show something that made people think that if he got to power, there would be something that would work of a constituent assembly, and it was simply something that had to do with the process. But that unfortunately generated, something that made people believe that he would overthrow institutions or go against the constitution. And for some reason, Abelardo de la Espriella became the constitutional patriot, the one who would not touch the Constitution. But if you look at his proposals, not only do they require constitutional reforms, but also an assembly. So these may be ideas that never materialize. Okay, with that perspective, you can think about them. But for example, he said, we will leave the inter-American human rights system. We will break away from the OAS, and that goes against the international human rights. And it speaks about his position vis-a-vis multilateralism. So this requires a situation that when a basic pillar of the Constitution is replaced, this can only be done through the assembly. And it requires so. When he says that he will establish life in prison for minors and for those who rape minors, of course, everybody agrees that that's a heinous crime that has to be prevented and punished. But life on prison is not good for anything. We've written so many times that it's a method that has no efficacy, but also this is a pillar of the Constitution. There had been a reform and the assembly overthrew it because it said it requires a constituent assembly. And so these are things that he is saying, and we may see him as a strange way of approaching his supposed position as a defender or a patriot of the Constitution. He also claims that he will shrink the state. He hasn't clarified how, but he will shrink the state by 40%. And he says things and then he steps backwards. But to end up with GP, it means overthrowing an institution that is based on the Constitution. And with JEP, it would involve the military who have already been recognized and who are free because of that agreement. They would put them in a very difficult situation because we would say, what happens with these people? Or the former FARC members who have complied with the peace treaty. One would say, what will we do with them? And this will also entail a drastic constitutional reform. Like this, I can give you many different examples. These mega prisons, for example. Okay, you can build prisons, but then the mega prisons are, like Marcela and Mr. Naranjo said, is to apply the Bukele method. And the Bukele method would require an exceptional legislation. So he's announcing that there will be a decree for a state of siege or something like that, and he will apply emergency laws so that he can massively detain people. He's a big showman, but like Alvaro Forero, when this goes to public policies, it doesn't become a reality. But I see a high number of things that are very risky, constitutionally speaking. And all of this outside his attitude and his own declarations and statements. When they challenge him, he says, "No, well, it's a metaphor," etc. So I think that some things are unacceptable. The way in which he has persecuted the press as a lawyer, any journalist that would say something against him, he would sue them. Imagine as a president. Already as a candidate, he threatened many journalists, saying that if they continued doing that, they would be criminally persecuted. And the fact that the United States is taking people and trying them because supposedly they have committed a crime instead of doing the due procedures, they ask for the involvement of the United States. These are all unconstitutional, very risky approaches. And to this, we must add the fact that he has he is in the process of becoming a U.S. citizen. He became a U.S. citizen. And when he took his oath, he said, and I quote, "I renounce my allegiance to Colombia and I would fight for the United States." And that is the president of Colombia, yes, who is rethinking national unity. And he is the chief of the public forces, of the law enforcement, and foreign relations. So this is not a minor thing. But for Colombia, this is not a minor thing. That they have pledged allegiance to the United States and has renounced their allegiance to Colombia. And now he's saying, well, no, Colombia comes first. So he either cheated on the US people or he is deceiving us. So all of this scenario leads to a very difficult situation. Whether he'll be able to do it or not, this will greatly depend on the coalitions that he is able to put together in Congress and how the courts will behave. And in coalitions, uh, they can do relatively well. He could do relatively well, and they're similar. But in the Senate, he could put together with his party the Democratic Center, the conservatives, and others who would join him, and Cambio Radical as well. So all of this would lead him to having about 42, 45 senators. So that would be almost 50%. And he could capture some of the Greens and some of the Liberals, and he could get majorities. So it's not impossible for him to put together some kind of coalition. The Congress is completely fractured, but the strongest opposition would come from the historical pact, from Pacto Histórico, sorry, and maybe some indigenous, some Greens, some liberals could join him, so they could have a majority. And it will depend on the court. But they're not in their best. The courts are independent. They're not in their best moment in terms of their prestige, but it could be an institutional counterweight. But when they say that the discourse is reassuring, I could say that believing in Abelardo de la Espriella is very difficult because 6 or 7 years he was an atheist a declared atheist, and saying that he admired Mancuso, who's a paramilitary, and now he's saying that he won the presidency, thanks to God, and that he will fight against all of the armed groups. So Abelardo de la Espriella is creating a difficult situation for himself, but I appreciate some of the things that he said yesterday in his acceptance speech, and I hope that he will govern for all Colombians, that he will respect the division of power, and that he will not persecute the opposition or the press. Thank you, Rodrigo. We only have a few minutes left, but I would like to give the last possibility to speak after what Rodrigo said. It's no longer the elephant in the room. We're talking about the United States and the relationship with the new government. We can talk about anti-drug policies, the war against drug trafficking, and we can talk about security, but this is very important. So can you talk a little bit about what should happen and what could be the foreign policy and the new approach of the new Colombian president, Mr. Naranjo? As a Colombian, one would hope that the new government would recognize the fact that our relationship with the United States has had bipartisan support for decades. And this bipartisan support today is being questioned. And the truth is that an alignment and closeness with the Republican Party and to Republican leaders have been something that has affected the relationship with the Democratic Party in the United States. I hope he understands that the relationship has to understand this bipartisanship, because soon there will be elections in the United States, and these elections could really mark a change in the composition of that Congress. Secondly, I think that it is not realistic to understand what the president-elect has said, that a 2.0 Colombia plan or a Patriot plan that he recommends is what is coming. Because the United States are undergoing a different logic now with respect to what cooperation means and the fight against crime. And I know this because I'm familiar with the discussions that have taken place, and it is highly unlikely that they're studying the possibility of implementing a Patriot plan or a Colombia 2.0 plan. 3, obviously, this new government will entail a relief in political tension that must translate into the strengthening of trust with respect to the exchange of information, of intelligence, that is quite stalled right now. And in that sense, I think that we do have a greater flow of information and intelligence shared between the United States and Colombia. And on the other hand, this morning, I heard Bernie Moreno say that Colombia would automatically become part of the countries that are part of the Shield of the Americas. And this announcement is an announcement that Colombians should study very closely. Why? Because we have heard the announcement of the Constitution of the, but we know that in this opinion, we have pragmatism and that is lacking, and the efforts for cooperation in terms of what it actually means. And one more thing, I hope Colombia stays away from a militarization in the security efforts of Latin America, because we are talking about militarization not only involving the participation of the military in police operations or operations that focus on justice. And we are not just talking about police who want to act as military when they are working. We are talking about a logic that has grown, and which means that criminals need to be eliminated and not subject to the law. I think that military logic, if Colombia falls into that trap and understands that this zero tolerance policy to eliminate your adversaries, I think would make things much worse. Thank you very much, General. And thank you very much, Marcela, Rodrigo, and James and Ken for their moderation. Thank you very much for moderating this interesting conversation. We will be following up closely until the inauguration. We will be sharing information on new events. Thank you to the interpreters for their hard work today. And thank you very much to all of you who followed. The videos will be available in French, English, and Spanish. They will be very soon available on our website, and we invite you to follow us on social media to know about our next events, and our events and the Stimson Center events. I cannot conclude this without mentioning the World Cup. This is the first time Canada's hosting, so I hope you're all enjoying and that you will continue enjoying all of the matches of the World Cup. Thank you very much and see you next time. Goodbye.